It was 12:56 p.m., October 16th, 2022, in the quiet suburban city of Lacey, Washington. Inside a 911 dispatch center, the phone suddenly rang. On the other end, there were no words, no clear sentences, just muffled, broken sounds, a woman's faint voice, trapped somewhere in the throat, as if silenced by force. That was all the dispatcher could hear. The operator asked calmly, "What are you reporting? Can you tell me what's happening?" But there was no coherent response, only gasps, whimpers, the unmistakable sound of a human being struggling to communicate. Experienced dispatchers know that silence can sometimes scream louder than words, and in this case, the dispatcher felt it. The caller was a woman, and she was in imminent danger. Something, perhaps tape or a hand, was covering her mouth. She couldn't speak, but she was still trying to cry for help. The operator reassured her. "All right, I'll get help for you right now. Hold on just a moment. Do you know your address?" Suddenly, more noises came through the line. The shuffling of feet, the banging of something heavy, chaotic thuds that sounded like a struggle, and then the chilling silence of a line still connected, but no longer alive with sound. Within minutes, digital tracing systems were engaged. Technicians worked to triangulate the signal from the woman's phone, or rather her Apple Watch, which appeared to be the source of the emergency call. The location data was passed to the nearest patrol units, but as officers sped toward the address, the voice on the line grew weaker, and then it was gone. To the people of Lacey, Washington, October 16th had begun like any ordinary Sunday. Families went to church, children played in the crisp autumn air, and neighborhoods buzzed with routine weekend errands. But behind closed doors in one home, a nightmare was unfolding. The woman who had dialed 911 was Suk An, age 42. She lived in a modest suburban house with her 2 children, a daughter, 20, and a son just 11 years old. Her husband, Chae Kyong An, age 53, no longer lived there. The couple had separated that summer. Years of escalating conflict, reports of domestic violence, and broken trust had pushed them toward divorce. Court documents show that Dong Suk had once been granted a protection order against her husband. But that protection was later revoked. Now Dong Suk remained in the family home with the children. Chae Kyong lived elsewhere. Still, he visited occasionally, sometimes to do laundry, sometimes to see the kids. On the surface, these visits seemed mundane, but each encounter carried the heavy weight of unresolved anger. At approximately 12:30 p.m. that Sunday, Dong Suk and her 2 children returned from church. In the driveway, they saw something all too familiar: Chae Kyong's vehicle parked outside. It wasn't unusual. Sundays were often the days he stopped by. The children barely had time to greet their father before their mother asked them to run to the grocery store. That small decision, sending the children away, may have spared their lives. Inside the house, only husband and wife remained. The conversation began with practical matters: divorce paperwork, financial arrangements, division of property. But tension rose quickly. Voices escalated. Years of resentment boiled to the surface, and then Chae Kyong snapped. He shouted, and then she remembered her Apple Watch. Despite her bindings, she managed to activate the emergency call function. First, she sent a text alert to her daughter and a friend. Then she dialed 911. The faint, muffled cries that reached the dispatcher were her desperate attempt to communicate through layers of duct tape. That was the call that triggered the police response. That was the call that may have saved her life. But as she tried to hold on to hope, her husband discovered the device. His reaction was swift, brutal. He ripped the watch from her wrist, smashed it with a hammer, and struck her arm in the process. The fragile line to the outside world went dead. By the time police units were dispatched to the home, Chae Kyong had already dragged his wife out of the bedroom, down the stairs, and into the garage. Neighbors' surveillance cameras captured the disturbing images. A man pulling a bound woman, struggling and helpless. Moments later, he shoved her into the trunk of his car. As his vehicle pulled away, a patrol car responding to the 911 trace happened to pass by in the opposite direction. The two vehicles briefly crossed paths. Officers were focused on reaching the address provided. They did not know they had just driven past the abductor himself. Inside the trunk, Dong-suk lay terrified, injured, and uncertain if she would live to see her children again. This was only the beginning of a case that would soon horrify not just the city of Lacey, but all of Washington state. A story of domestic conflict spiraling into attempted murder. A chilling reminder of how quickly a family home can turn into a crime scene. And as investigators would later uncover, this was not an impulsive act. It was a carefully escalating plan that came frighteningly close to ending in death. This is the story of the attempted murder of Suk An and her. To understand how a Sunday afternoon turned into a crime scene, we must look deeper. Behind the duct tape and the 911 call lay a history of broken trust, unresolved conflict, and a marriage that had slowly unraveled. Who were Dong-suk and Chae Kyong An? And how did their lives reach such a dangerous crossroads? Dong-suk An was described by friends as gentle, hard-working, and devoted to her children. She immigrated from South Korea to the United States, building a life in Washington state with her husband. The couple appeared, at least from the outside, to be a model immigrant family. Churchgoers, parents, striving for stability. But beneath that surface, tension had been growing. According to court documents, the marriage had become strained long before 2022. There were reports of verbal abuse, controlling behavior, and incidents of domestic conflict. At one point, Dong-suk sought and obtained a protection order against her husband. That order was later revoked, but the underlying issues never disappeared. Neighbors would later tell investigators that they occasionally heard arguments from the house. Nothing that immediately signaled violence, but enough to suggest that harmony was a fragile illusion. Chae Kyong An, by contrast, had a very different reputation. He was not a man without accomplishments. In fact, he was a U.S. Army veteran and a former intelligence employee who had spent decades in service-related roles. To colleagues, he was disciplined, controlled, and meticulous. He had no criminal record. On paper, he was the last person anyone would expect to see in handcuffs. But those who live closest to someone often see what the public does not. Behind closed doors, Dong-suk knew another side. A man who could be domineering, bitter, and unwilling to accept change. The separation in mid-2022 marked the breaking point. She lived in. The children, too, were caught in the middle. The daughter, already in college, had taken on the role of messenger and quiet protector, often checking on her mother's safety. The younger son, only 11, was shielded from the worst of the arguments, but could not be shielded from the tension that filled the home. On the morning of October 16th, when their mother sent them to the store, the children thought little of it. It was a simple errand. They could not have imagined that within minutes their father would turn violent. Later, when they returned home, police officers were already swarming the neighborhood. Their mother was gone. Their father was missing. In that moment, childhood ended abruptly. From an investigative standpoint, the seeds of this tragedy were visible long before that October day. Experts in domestic violence often speak of the cycle of escalation. Tension builds, arguments intensify, and when one partner feels cornered, whether emotionally, financially, or legally, violence can erupt. In this case, all three factors were present: emotional resentment from years of conflict, financial pressure from divorce proceedings, legal battles over property and support. Put together, they created a perfect storm. What makes this case especially chilling is that it unfolded not in isolation, but in a community where others saw fragments of the struggle. Church friends knew the couple was separating. Neighbors occasionally heard raised voices. A court had once issued, and then lifted, a protective order. Yet, like so many cases of domestic violence, the danger was underestimated until it exploded. By the fall of 2022, Dong-suk was focused on moving forward. She wanted stability for her children. She wanted peace. She was preparing for life after divorce. But Chae Kyong was unwilling to accept that reality. His identity, pride. By the time police arrived at the An family home, the crime scene was already in motion. Inside the garage, officers found shards of broken plastic and shattered glass, the remnants of an Apple Watch. Upstairs, strips of duct tape littered the floor. There was no sign of Dong-suk, but neighbors' surveillance footage filled in the missing pieces. On the screen, officers watched in silence as the grainy image unfolded. A man dragging a bound woman across the driveway, her body struggling, her cries muffled. Seconds later, he forced her into the trunk of a dark-colored sedan. The trunk slammed shut. The car pulled away. The victim was gone, and the suspect, her husband, Chae Kyong An, was now on the run. Inside the trunk, darkness pressed against every breath. Duct tape cut into Dong-suk's wrists and ankles. Every bump of the road jolted her bruised body. She could taste blood. She could hear the hum of the engine above her. She thought of her children. Was this the end? But survival instinct is powerful. Even as pain coursed through her, she searched for escape, loosening tape with every movement, straining against the bindings. Her mind replayed the dispatcher's voice. Help is on the way. She clung to that fragment of hope. The drive lasted less than 20 minutes. Then the car slowed, turned onto a dirt road, and came to a stop. When the trunk opened, daylight seared her eyes. Chae Kyong pulled her out, dragged her through brush and branches, deeper into the woods of Lacey. The forest was quiet, save for the crunch of footsteps and the labored sound of her breathing. At a small clearing, he forced her to the ground. There, he produced a knife. The blade plunged into her chest. Once. Twice. A searing shock tore through her. But she was not finished. Somehow, through shock, through pain, through sheer determination, Dong-suk clawed at the soil. Each movement tore at her wounds, but she refused to surrender. She twisted her wrists against the duct tape until the bindings gave way. Dirt filled her mouth, but she spat it out. Her lungs screamed for air, but she kept digging. Minute by agonizing minute, she pushed upward. Until finally, her hand broke through the surface. She was alive. Crawling from the shallow grave, Dong-suk staggered through the forest. Blood soaked her clothing. The world blurred. Yet she kept moving. She had no phone, no weapon, no clear direction. Only the instinct to survive. At approximately 12:50 a.m., more than 12 hours after the ordeal began, she stumbled onto a remote rural property. A porch light glowed faintly in the darkness. She banged on the door with the last of her strength. When the homeowner opened it, he recoiled at the sight. A woman, battered, bloodied, covered in dirt, pleading for help. Her words were chilling. "My husband is trying to kill me." The homeowner immediately dialed 911. Paramedics rushed to the scene. Dong-suk was transported to the hospital, where doctors confirmed stab wounds to her chest, extensive bruising, and signs of attempted poisoning. But against all odds, she had survived. Meanwhile, the manhunt for Chae Kyong intensified. Detectives traced his movements through surveillance footage and digital forensics. By dawn, they located his vehicle abandoned near a forested road. At 7:38 a.m. on October 17th, less than 24 hours after the abduction, deputies spotted Chae Kyong walking nearby. He was arrested without incident. The former Army veteran and intelligence employee. 4. The trial, the consequences, and the lessons this case has left behind. By sunrise on October 17, 2022, the manhunt was over. Former Army veteran and intelligence employee Chae Kyong An sat in police custody, charged with the attempted murder of his wife. But for investigators and for the community of Lacey, Washington, the story was far from finished. The courtroom would become the next battlefield. At his first appearance before the judge, Chae Kyong wore a standard orange jail jumpsuit. The charges read aloud were grave. Attempted first-degree murder, first-degree kidnapping, first-degree assault with a deadly weapon. The courtroom was tense. Seated just a few feet away under protection was Suk An, still bearing bandages, still recovering from stab wounds, and still carrying the memory of being buried alive. When given the opportunity to speak, she addressed the court with trembling but resolute words. "I believe my husband will kill me if he is released. Please, do not let him out." Her voice cut through the room. The request was clear. The judge agreed. Bail was denied. Chae Kyong An would remain behind bars as the legal process moved forward. The trial preparation revealed the depth of the case. Investigators presented physical evidence: the shallow grave, the duct tape, the broken Apple Watch, the surveillance footage. Forensic specialists analyzed blood samples from the site and confirmed they matched the victim. Medical experts testified about the stab wounds, the attempted poisoning, and the extraordinary survival against odds. But perhaps the most powerful testimony came from Dong-suk herself. On the witness stand, she recounted the horror in painstaking detail. The argument, the bindings, the hammer, the trunk, the woods, the knife, the soil covering her face. Each word was heavy with lived terror. Observers noted that jurors guilty of attempted murder, guilty of kidnapping, guilty of assault. For Dong Suk, the verdict was more than justice. It was survival secured. No longer would she have to look over her shoulder, fearing that her husband might return. Yet freedom from fear did not erase the trauma. Friends described her as quiet, cautious, a woman healing both physically and emotionally. The scars on her chest were visible. The scars inside remained unseen. Her children, too, carried the weight. A daughter forced into the role of protector, an 11-year-old boy forced to reconcile the image of his father with the reality of attempted murder. Childhood innocence had been shattered. From a broader perspective, the case became a stark example of domestic violence escalation. Experts in family law noted the warning signs: a past protective order, later revoked, escalating arguments over divorce and finances, a husband openly declaring he would never accept spousal support, a pattern of control and intimidation. Each sign on its own might have seemed manageable. Together they formed a dangerous trajectory. The lesson is chillingly clear. When patterns of domestic abuse go unaddressed, they can culminate in lethal violence. In community discussions following the trial, advocates stressed the importance of support systems, safe shelters, legal protections, and community awareness. They pointed to Dong Suk's Apple Watch call as both tragic and heroic. Tragic because it was destroyed before officers could arrive. Heroic because even in her darkest moment, she found a way to call for help. One advocate remarked, "Her courage in the face of death is what saved her." But no victim should have to claw out of their own grave to be heard. Today, the case of Dong Suk An stands as both a warning